So what is the Merchant Navy? Despite its name, the Merchant Navy isn't much like the Royal Navy. In fact, it's nothing like the Royal Navy. This is actually just a title granted by George V, which groups together a whole gaggle of separate, competing and private companies. He did this to show his appreciation for the work merchant mariners had done to keep the country supplied during the First World War. Britain is a small, overpopulated island, and even back then it wasn't able to produce enough food for everybody on it. If it had not been for the Merchant Navy running the German blockade, Britain would have been starved into submission. The jumbled mess of companies known as the Merchant Navy is matched by an equally jumbled mess when it comes to recruitment and training. There were charitable organisations, technical and private schools, and even some local education authorities that offered training for officers and deckhands. To become an officer, the most important thing that you need to know was the science and art of navigation. You could learn a lot simply by observing what other people were doing. But if you wanted to venture beyond the coastal trade and out of the sight of land, you needed to understand complex mathematics. With the growth in trade over the deep oceans in the 15th century, navigation schools started to pop up and were perhaps the earliest form of vocational education. Unfortunately, they also tended to be run by mathematicians rather than seafarers, and became an example of that phrase, those that can do, those that can't teach. There is a big difference between making some calculations in a classroom and shooting the sun on a rolling deck of a ship. But once you've learned this art, it could take you an awfully long way. In 1895, it took Captain Joshua Slocum all the way around the world. He became the first person to sail around the world alone, navigating just using a compass, his sextant and a tin clock that he'd managed to buy for $1.50. He'd managed to get his ship, the Spray, for even less than that from a man who simply wanted to get rid of her. However, most ship owners wanted a bit more reassurance that they would actually get to sit their ships back before letting them out of their sight. There was no official test before 1851, so ship owners would ask for references and testimonials, but even experienced captains could still make a mistake. In 1846, Captain Hoskin was taking his vessel from Liverpool to the United States when he ran into a little problem. Ireland. The ship ran up a beach near Killaloe and stuck there. They followed the Birkenhead drill. Women and children were ferried to land on the ship's boats, leaving the men on board. Luckily, she had run so far up the beach that when the tide went out there was only 18 inches of water at the bows, so they just waded ashore. They tried to float her off at the next high tide, but she was stuck fast. She had to wait all winter until there was a tide high enough to free her. Any other ship would have broken up in winter storms, but this was the SS Great Britain, the world's first iron ship. She was able to weather the storms and continued in service for another 40 years. The fact that she was the world's first iron ship might well have had something to do with her grounding. All of that iron would have affected the ship's compass, meaning Ireland was not where they expected it to be. When the paddle steamer Superb hit the Minky's Reef in 1850, the captain would have had a lot less of an excuse. He knew all about this reef. He'd wrecked his previous ship there not 1 week before. They were doing the regular run between St Malo in France and St Helier in Jersey on a flat, calm day when they struck the rocks and started to fill with water. She only had 2 lifeboats and there was a mad scramble to get into them. But ironically, it was those that didn't manage to get a place on the lifeboats who were the lucky ones. In the panic, somebody had forgot to put the bungs in the bottom of the boats, so as they rowed away, they started to fill with water, and the people left on the Superb could only watch as they slowly sank beneath the waves. The people on board were taken off later, when they were seen by a cutter called the Jupiter, but the ship would not budge. She was so firmly wedged that when the tide went out she could be seen from Jersey balanced precariously on the top of the reef. This could have helped to inspire Victor Hugo when he was writing his novel Toiler of the Sea, during his exile on the Channel Islands, as this book is centred around the efforts to salvage a steamship which had been left high and dry on a reef. In the same year that the Superb was wrecked, the government decided to act. They passed legislation requiring that all officers of ships heading out of British waters had to have a certificate of competency, something that might have been a challenge for Captain Priaulx. Most people got their certificates after learning on the job. They did this by signing up as an apprentice with one of the shipping companies. These weren't particularly picky about who signed up as an apprentice, as apprentices received little or no pay, and they would often have to buy their way in with a lump sum payment given to the shipping company. You could be one half of Siamese twins and sign an indenture, although it might get a bit awkward if your twin was looking for a different kind of career. The only time that the government got involved was when they took their exam and its accompanying medical. The latter was pretty basic, by which I mean so long as you weren't blind, deaf or a drooling idiot, then you would probably pass. They were mainly just checking that people could tell support markers from starboard. Some lads were offered the chance of taking the medical before signing up in order to make sure they could eventually get their certificates. Although between 1850 and 1900, 38% of those rejected still managed to pass on appeal. The majority of apprentices served on sailing ships. They would work alongside the rest of the crew in order to literally learn the ropes. They kept double watches, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, as did most of the crew, and anybody on deck had to be doing something. There was no standing about idle, and the officers made sure to keep everybody at work, even if there was nothing to be done other than scraping rust from the anchor chains. Whether the apprentices were actually taught anything or just treated as cheap labour was entirely up to the ship owner. There were some lines where it was completely unheard of for an apprentice to receive any kind of navigation instruction at all, but there were others which were better. Richard Dale, an apprentice on the Toxteth, wrote in 1895 that he managed to get some kind of navigation training twice a month during his time off watch, which was an improvement on what went before. This was possibly because the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894, which had given the superintendent of the Mercantile Marine Office the duty of supervising the apprentices. Things kept improving. Between 1900 and 1904, the apprentices on the Illawarra were given an experience of practically every task on the ship, as well as 2 hours of classes every single day, except Sundays. As the apprentices were bound to the shipping company for a set period, the company was also responsible for them between voyages, unlike the rest of the crew. Some were simply left to live on board the ship, more or less on their own. Others were allowed to go home, and a few might even be sent off somewhere where they could learn navigation. But generally, shipmasters assumed that the apprentices would obtain their certificates in the same way that they got theirs, by cramming for a few weeks before taking the test. There were always two routes to becoming a merchant navy officer. Anybody could take the exams. There was nothing to stop you from joining as a decky, then working your way up to become the master of a ship. Alternatively, you could go to an officer school before going to sea. A large number of officer training establishments were set up to teach what was needed to pass the Board of Trade tests. These tended to deal with boys of 16 or 17 years of age. The students were known as cadets, and they wore a uniform similar to the cadets at HMS Britannia at Dartmouth. The most famous of these were the Conway, set up in 1859 on the River Mersey, the Worcester, set up in 1862 on the River Thames, and Pangbourne Nautical College, set up in 1917. All three were boarding schools. The cadets would learn together, sail together, and live as one unit. They concentrated on building character, with some technical training, but no managerial training at all. They grew from a comparatively small start. When Worcester opened its doors, it had only 20 cadets, but this was more than Conway had started with 3 years earlier. They had to pay comparatively large fees to attend, and for this they received a year's remission in their apprenticeship. At the time, paying fees to schools was common. Before 1902, the state didn't provide any secondary education at all. If your parents had less than an income of £100 a year, it was unlikely that you could afford it, and at the time, this was a lot of money. If you couldn't, then your only hope was to try and get a scholarship, like the one that was set up by P&O in 1907. Anybody lucky enough to get this would get their £35 a year fees paid. The Royal Mail followed suit, and like P&O, it waived the indenture payment for becoming an apprentice, as well as giving a £30 uniform allowance. Some lines, such as the Underhill Line and the White Star Line, operated their own sail training vessels, but it was Daverton Moore who put the most effort into training new officers, and had a cargo-carrying sailing ship specifically for this. This ship operated from 1890 to the end of the First World War. It carried an instructor, but the ship's masters, mates and doctor also gave classes to apprentices during their watches below. There was even prizes for the most successful in the exams, which came at the end of each voyage. The First World War ended this ocean training scheme, which moved ashore to the newly built Pangbourne Nautical College. Another change which followed the end of the First World War was the introduction of the term Merchant Navy and an official Merchant Navy uniform. As with so much with the mercantile marine, whether people actually wore it or not was entirely up to the women of the shipping company. Some of them already had their own company livery, and the small coasters and tramps simply didn't bother with a uniform at all. Whether or not an apprentice was given a uniform, they wouldn't wear it much aboard a ship, as most of the work they were given would have just spoilt it. By the 1930s, the Alfred Holt Company, the Blue Funnel Line, was taking about half of its apprentices from specialist training institutions, such as the Worcester and Conway, and the other half from normal schools. But as the country headed towards the Second World War, there was a desire to standardise and nationalise how merchant navy officers were trained. This would make it closer to how they were trained on the continent. By 1935, a central board was set up for the merchant service. It created a common admission criteria and a training schedule for all apprentices across the entire shipping industry. By 1942, this scheme was extended to cover cooks, engineers, stewards and even deckies. By 1950, 144 companies were participating with over 3,000 apprentices registered with the scheme, although some companies still prefer to make their own arrangements. But as time went on, fewer boys wanted to join the Merchant Navy. Part of this was because in order to join it, you had to leave school at 16 or 17 to become an apprentice. The Merchant Navy was the only profession which penalised people for staying longer at school. This reduction in demand led to the Worcester merging with King Edward VIII Nautical College in 1968 to become the new Merchant Navy College. Conway completely closed in 1974 after 115 years of training officers. Of the three great nautical colleges, the only one still running is Pangbourne College, and it too has shifted away from being a nautical college. It even dropped the word nautical from its name in 1969. This was the end of the era of the training ships. Another one shut down in the 1960s was the famous training ship Mercury, which was shut down in 1968. And in the next video I'm going to go over her story and the story of the formidable woman that led her.